I shouldn't say simple exactly, but for the right use case, it's hard to beat WebDirect, especially if you don't really want to learn JSON, CSS,
Yeah, yeah.
HTML. If you don't have any expertise on that and don't care to learn it, pretty hard to beat WebDirect as a FileMaker developer. But on the other hand, it's hard to beat BetterForms if you've decided that you're still going to use FileMaker, but you really want a full stack style, fully web standards compliant web application that your end users are going to find indistinguishable from any other good web app that they're using. Well, thanks for joining us today on Portage Bay's DevCast. Our sometime host Dan Smiley can't join us today. He's working a oil spill exercise in Helena, Montana this morning, and so I'll be acting as our DevCast host. This morning we're going to talk a little bit about this morning my time. I guess it's not morning for everybody, but we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different options for integrating FileMaker data with a web front end. A couple of our newer developers, team members, not newer developers, but newer team members have not used FileMaker BetterForms. Everybody's familiar with WebDirect, but sometimes not some of the other tools. So we're going to talk a little bit about some of the different ways of integrating FileMaker with the web, with a bit of an emphasis on BetterForms, which is a tool we really like for certain cases. Charlie, one of our newest team members, is asking a little bit about whether the WebDirect work that he's done with one of our clients is something we want to continue with, or whether we want to consider switching over to BetterForms or some other web tool. So, as a catalyst for discussion, we're going to use that work to talk about. So, Charlie, do you want to tell us a little bit about that WebDirect stuff?
Yeah, so we have a client that is doing some seed testing that would like to allow their customers to view the information, the results of those tests on a web interface. Currently, we're using WebDirect, and it does work pretty well, but it has its own challenges. Some of the exporting of PDFs and some of the exporting of other documents is a little weird on WebDirect. There's some issues with compatibility and getting different networks to really accept and like WebDirect in certain cases. So we've been considering different options and was hoping that some of the guys here could give an explanation of BetterForms and see if that might work for what we're trying to do.
Sounds good. Why don't we talk a little bit about BetterForms versus WebDirect versus other web tools? I was trying to make a list of options, and there's quite a few, and we're obviously not going to talk about all of them today, but I was coming up with WebDirect, obviously, BetterForms. Certainly, we can create a full stack web app that talks to FileMaker through the data API. We could do an integration with another tool like Gravity Forms or JotForm, where we're using one of them as the web front end and pulling the data into FileMaker. Could do the same thing with Google Sheets. We could use FileMaker. We could use Clara Studio to gather data from the website and get it into FileMaker. So there's a lot of tools out there. But starting with WebDirect, so anybody want to comment on good cases for using WebDirect versus less good use cases for using WebDirect?
WebDirect is like super simple. So like if you're not trying to go out and learn the whole world of the web, HTML, CSS, JavaScript, you're probably going to be feeling pretty comfortable in WebDirect because FileMaker does all of that for you, right? They translate all the layouts and those types of things into HTML, CSS, and JavaScript on a website. And they also provide the actual web server itself or the web engine.
Yeah, yeah. It's hard to get any simpler than WebDirect.
Yeah,
Yeah.
the downside of WebDirect is that it has a heavy licensing cost.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it is expensive. from a licensing standpoint. In my mind, I have a simple rule of thumb. If it's a public-facing situation where you have anonymous end users, then WebDirect might not be the ideal choice. If you have a situation where you have a fairly normal FileMaker client base, you've got 15 or 20 users trying to, or even 50 or 100 users, but it's a fairly controlled group of users, and you've got the FileMaker client deployed to 15 of them, and 5 of them are remote users, and you just don't want to deploy the FileMaker client, then that's a great situation for WebDirect. Just let those people connect in through a web browser. They're going to have a normal FileMaker license anyway, so there's no increase in cost for licensing. But yeah, trying to do a WebDirect solution where the end users are anonymous web users can be an expensive licensing situation. Yeah, if you have Charlie, you were saying, Charlie was bringing up a good point in the Zoom chat. I'll let you bring it up, Charlie, since it's your point.
Yeah. I just wanted to comment. One of the things that can keep that cost of WebDirect down is if your clients are on a site license. Site license does get you unlimited WebDirect connections. So
Right.
that's a very good way to work your clients into a site license if you do need a heavy WebDirect presence.
Yeah, I think there's a corner case there, depending on the size of the number of employees in the company and the number of WebDirect users needed. There's definitely a place there where a site license really does help and make WebDirect a more economical solution. Diving off into the disadvantages of WebDirect, I guess the biggest one for me is you just don't get a quote unquote normal web experience. You get FileMaker in a web browser, which is great, but it's not if you've got a bunch of anonymous users connecting from unknown browsers with unknown experience levels, you're giving them a little bit of a non-standard web experience, which can be, depending on the situation, either highly undesirable or just moderately undesirable, but it's usually not ideal. So in addition to the licensing cost, to me, that's the other big disadvantage of WebDirect is it just doesn't, in some situations, it just doesn't give your end users a standards compliant enough browsing experience.
Yeah.
So I assume that's sort of the problem with the client you're talking about, Charlie. They kind of perhaps need a more standard browsing experience.
Yeah, it would be nice. WebDirect even starts to struggle when a user uses the back button or the refresh button on a web browser.
Yeah.
Both of those can cause issues with your session, having to re-log in.
Yeah.
Which does create a very non-standard user experience while they're on the web.
Yeah, it puts you in a little bit of a bind, and from a support standpoint, you end up having to support things like what happens when the back button gets clicked or the refresh button gets clicked or whatever. It's an unfortunate situation. I don't think obviously we don't have time to go into all of the different options that that I threw out there, the JotForm integrations, the Google Sheet integrations, different ways of letting end users put web data in and get them into FileMaker, and a lot of them aren't appropriate to what we're talking about with the client Charlie's bringing up anyway. So how about if we dive into whether or not it's a great idea to do a full stack web app connecting to FileMaker's data API. We're kind of looking at in terms of ways of giving a good web application experience to an end user. WebDirect having some limitations. We can create a really standards compliant web app using a full stack approach where we do everything somewhat manually. We manage the backend connection to the FileMaker data API. We manage a deployment technology. We manage the front end, and we've done that on a number of projects. And then we've also used FileMaker BetterForms, which takes care of some of that for us. Jacob, do you want to talk a little bit about, I know you and I talked about this ahead of time, so do you want to talk a little bit about what the advantages FileMaker BetterForms brings versus something full stack wise?
Yeah, sure. I think like in terms of like decision making between better forms and like a full stack approach, uh, really boils down to like, is it connecting to a FileMaker file? Better forms has solved so many things with connecting just to the FileMaker file via XML through the server that other methods using the data API and full stack, there's a bunch of different libraries and things that people have written, but nothing is really as solid as Better Forms is. And they've also basically facilitated the whole pipeline for you. You have versioning, deployment. It's most of the backend code is literally scripting in FileMaker, which most FileMaker developers are super comfortable with that. So when you're making requests from the front end and you're working with JSON, you're sending a request to the back end, which is a FileMaker script, and it's returning data to you. And that comfort level, I think, is something for a FileMaker developer approaching like this type of task would feel pretty confident in. And that's why Better Forms would be probably a stronger platform, right? As opposed to like a full stack app where you're literally having to do everything. Better Forms is providing, additional libraries that they're already including in there, like Tailwind, Bootstrap, Lodash, which is a popular like functions library for JavaScript. Those are just like things that they've included because they know you're probably going to use them. Whereas if you're doing the full stack approach, you probably have to consider those, right?
And a key factor that you might not think about is that they're taking care of updating those libraries. So 8 months from now,
Yes.
8 months from now, when Tailwind has a security vulnerability, BetterForms is going to take care of updating that, and you don't have to take on that back-end maintenance task in the future. I think that's kind of a big one also.
I would
Can you
say
give
up until a
me,
few days ago, it was kind of daunting taking or going for Better Forms just because their documentation was pretty poor. But they've recently updated that. So if you haven't looked, I would take another look. They've updated it. So
That's
can
good.
you give me
sorry, Mike.
I was wondering if there's a cost analysis that you could sort of inform users on about, or a client on, or what the cost of a full stack versus implementing Better Forms. There's a cost of Better Forms. But there's also a cost for development for full stack and maintenance and update.
Yeah, that might be more a question for you, John.
I mean, that's a complicated one to answer fully within the context of this DevCast, but some things to think about there. One is that you can go to BetterForms website and look at their pricing. If you're doing a full stack app, then you're hosting it somewhere. So like for the full stack apps that we've done for clients, we're using Google Cloud Platform. We're using GCP for those. So we have a cost for that. We're also hosting the FileMaker databases there somewhere. So those clients have FileMaker hosting accounts somewhere. None of the clients that we've done those projects for are doing on-premise hosting, which has a cost itself, of course. But in those cases, they all have a GCP cost and a FileMaker hosting cost. And so with BetterForms, you've got more or less the same thing. You are hosting your FileMaker data somewhere, and you're already paying for that. And you need to host your web application somewhere. And so in the case of using BetterForms, you're paying their fee. So it's from a cost standpoint, it's the exact
You also
dollar.
have the total time for the developer and
Yeah, and
That was kind of
that's where
my question.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's where your big savings is, I think, with BetterForms is you only need one developer, maybe two. So we're assuming for the sake of this discussion, we're assuming we're FileMaker developers. We already can handle the FileMaker side. On the web side, we need someone who can learn BetterForms and and has good skills with JavaScript and probably CSS and some other tools, but all front end web design tools. With BetterForms, we don't need a back-end developer. We don't need a DB admin. We don't need a specialist in pipeline management. All that back-end stuff we don't need with BetterForms. So we for our company, for Portage Bay, it helps us. It helps limit the expertise that we're required to have on staff to be able to create a really good full stack, a web application that looks full stack, that is full stack from a user interface standpoint, but doesn't require the same kinds of back end expertise.
And to me, like when it comes to learning, when I went to go learn FM BetterForms, their code editor makes it pretty simple to kind of like test and try other ways. Like within their code editor, they have like this option to click a small code block to just see how that builds, and it makes it really easy to learn kind of how their syntax looks when you're deploying and coding. And their dev and deploy model also is really simple to use. Like you can just click between dev or production to kind of just look at your different versioning. And so BetterForms has been really pretty simple to learn thus far, so it's good. And then with they have their helper file, that lets you look at the inbound and outbound responses and requests, so that helps too with debugging, and it sometimes can supply good error codes if there's any bugs or anything. So it just makes it pretty easy to use.
Talking about how this would work for the client that's using WebDirect that we started talking about, we would obviously we'd have to redevelop the app as a full stack web app, not using full stack tools, but using JavaScript, CSS, using the tools that we use with FM BetterForms. The problems, how would it solve the problems that we see with WebDirect? I mean, for one, it would allow us to create a quote unquote standards compliant web application that is mobile responsive, that the back and forward buttons work properly, that is still tightly integrated into the FileMaker security engine, but the refresh button works as expected and all that. The other issues, Charlie, that you were talking about, like the problem with the PDF, what are some of the other than some of those back and forward buttons, refresh button kind of issues? What are some of the other issues that you're thinking could be solved by a change in how we're approaching that?
One of the hopes that we have is that it might be able to reduce the number of clicks needed to download attachments out of FileMaker. Currently, WebDirect is we have the capability of doing a lot, but we don't have the capability of customizing the process very much. So for example, if we want to export the field contents of a container, we can do that pretty easily, but it ends up being a handful of dialog boxes. I think there's 2 or 3 dialog boxes that the user must interact with each time. When we have users downloading several of these items at a time, that can cause some complaints among those users just with that repetitive work. Hopefully BetterForms maybe would give us some more options, some different options, some more customizable options for some of those processes, like downloading attachments.
Right.
Yeah, so just like JavaScript in general, or full stack, whether you do it on BetterForms or in a full stack app, you can include libraries in both places, right? So that's another benefit to to BetterForms as well as full stack, where they're tried and true methods of downloading PDFs in the browser space, right? People do this all the time. You go to websites, click a button, it downloads a PDF natively, right?
Right.
Those libraries exist, and you can include them if you were doing a web app approach, right? WebDirect doesn't have that ability. You're scripting a container grab and doing some temp store on the back end and then throwing it back to the user, right? I'm assuming. And
Right. Yeah.
that's probably why you're getting all these additional dialog boxes, because the whole WebDirect interface is inside of a virtualized iframe, essentially.
Yeah, the full stack BetterForms is, I'm going to call it a lower level of control over everything. We're not relying on FileMaker's interpretation of the web of the FileMaker elements and translating it into HTML. We're creating the CSS and HTML ourselves, and so there's a lower level of control that should allow us to create a more customized user experience.
Yeah, I think that's kind of nice though, like being able to just think of like the database as data, and rather than I mean, FileMaker encompasses a whole lot more than that, but like when you're building web apps and those types of things, like that's all it is. You're just passing data back to the front end. So.
Jacob, do you want to show the BetterForms interface just a little bit?
Sure. This is the BetterForms interface. We have some file assets that we can include. So this is somewhat of a content management. I mean, this supports numerous types, text, logos, I don't know, anything you could think of that you'd want in assets. You have a server level where you can list your servers. I don't know how much I should share, but let's go ahead and go through the process of creating like a new app. So they've changed this too. So this is not the approach it used to be. You can now select a template or rebuild from an existing app. And they have actually like tailored tagged selections to what's unique about each section of development. So if you were trying to build, let's say, a progressive web app, right, which is something you could download on your phone, which I think BetterForms kind of showcased at Claire's Engage. They had their own app there. They were using that progressive web app approach, right? Which essentially creates a web app of your app or isolation on your phone. Newer methods. But let's say we just wanted to start with, we'll pick this one here. It's the multi-page application. Probably standard. They're even rating now how hard this would be, as well as providing like details of what's included in this library or this template. And they've already included the CDN for Tailwind. So if we use this template, we can give this app a name. We'll say DevCast test. We'll just say DevCast. DevCast. We hopefully we'll delete all this afterwards. I'm just gonna pick Cedar. Did I miss something?
Does say no domains available. Yeah.
Yeah, let's pick this other one. They have noted that, and this is in the documentation as well, that there are so many people using BetterForms that their native BetterForms domain is full. So now they have an additional space for building apps. It's the clientportal.cloud. But you can see it's deploying this entire environment, and kind of gives you some details about what's been set up for you. The development environment is here. We can go here. Well, once it finishes, it takes a minute for this to initialize. Probably this is why this is here. It says it's updating. So they're actually building this space in one of their, I think they're using AWS, and they're essentially creating like a serverless, I want to say serverless process that runs for this environment. I could be wrong on that.
An important side note for some people anyway would be that the data never resides at BetterForms. They're not storing your data at all. The data never exists except on your server. So I know there've been a few situations when I've been talking to clients where they've had a concern about their data going somewhere else, but the data is being pushed and pulled from our clients or our FileMaker server. It's not going to FM BetterForms' server.
So this is the standard the standard pages. So they have everything kind of divided out here. There's these are the pages directly that you work with. In this case, it looks like a registration form. Right. Everything's in JSON. So if you have a good understanding of JSON, this structure may look familiar to you. Some of it may be gibberish, depending on like some sections. So that's why like HTML and CSS is like important. All these things that you see right here are style classes being applied to an element. In this case, this element is an HTML element, and they provide a way for us to kind of open up these independently and have kind of a more IDE approach, right? But all this is a div with an empty class. There's nothing in here, and it says tell us about you.
Really good illustration of even just up to this point of the advantage of WebDirect. You don't need to know what a div class is with WebDirect. There's no question that BetterForms, if in a progression of tools, WebDirect being the easiest one to use, BetterForms is easier to use than a full stack environment because it frees you up from all the backend stuff, but it does not free you up from you really, to be effective with it, you really do have to have good understanding of HTML, CSS, JSON, probably some JavaScript to get to more advanced stuff, right?
Yeah. I really around the JSON for like as it involves the data model. So like one example here I'll show you is you have the option of like including a dev data model. In this case, they've already have one here pre-generated. It's called states, right? So like if you wanted to use dev data to test like a scenario in your HTML you're trying to write, and you wanted to render that, well, I'm going to toggle on dev data, and we know that this is from JSON. You have a states object or array inside of our object. So if we just added, and this is view syntax inside of HTML, so their library supports view, which uses handlebars. We can include states, right? And states is an array. So let's grab the first item, and I think let's go with name. And I think I'm missing, so everything's declared inside of the model. Oops. So just like that, we've just added, tell us about you, Alabama, pulling from the actual data. That's, this would essentially, you could mock up an entire data set that you would create in FileMaker, right? And if you could imagine what you could create in FileMaker as JSON and send it to the front end, anything you can do that way, all of that is possible to manipulate on the front end, right? Given the tools that they're providing you. And that's true about all the instances. I mean, they've even built out entire snippets that are elements or tables, things that you probably include in your web app anyways. They've been pre-built, right? You can just leverage an entire component that's already been built for you and throw it into your web app. So you're not entirely starting from scratch. The same is true as if you go and do full stack, you could leverage other libraries and things like that, but they're not doing anything different. It's just this is all kind of tailored towards like the FileMaker approach.
Right.
And I feel like they're very FileMaker focused. So if your data is in FileMaker already, it makes sense to use a tool like this versus
Right.
A full stack web app. But if your data is not in FileMaker, Yeah, you're probably
considerations.
considering a full stack.
Mhm.
Well,
Yeah,
I
and
think
with
I think there's also some full stack. There's obviously some full stack considerations if you've got a situation that's enterprise scale. You know, if you're dealing with a web application that needs to handle hundreds or thousands of concurrent connections per second or something like that, ultimately FileMaker BetterForms is reading and writing data to the FileMaker database server, and it, you know, you are subject to some limits there. And so if you're trying to create a web application that has to handle truly significant loads, then you're probably looking at full stack as well.
Yeah.
Russell, I'm sorry, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was just going to mention that a cool piece of having this deployment stage or development stage is you have access to their dev tools. So I think it was there a second ago, but when you're looking at your dev link, yeah, you have this developer tool, so you can have access to your model object at any point, so you can see live
Yeah,
kind of
so
what your data is at any moment when you're in dev.
yeah, so if you think of this like as your empty canvas, right? This is a form you're going to load empty probably to some user, uh, and we can type things in and actually see them populating the data model here, right? So like they've divided this into the application, right? And the application contains keys for name first, name last, and that's what we filled in. But you can control the structure of that. So it doesn't necessarily need to be like the application. If you defined it differently and you had a different set of rules for your, the way you wanted to manage your data, this could be like application and then a sub object, right? That's tell us about you. So then you have sections and then you define like each one of those fields. So you have complete flexibility of how you want to manage the data and send the data back.
And it's all in
which I think is pretty
FileMaker.
cool. Yeah, and
It's all done in FileMaker, which makes it even easier for FileMaker developers because you're doing it there. Makes it all
yeah, it's all JSON
easy.
coming back into FileMaker. So
Mhm.
you manipulate it however you want. Yeah.
Which is, I mean, that's the primary goal, right? Like when you're building an integration with FileMaker, all you really want is that data to be pushed around. You know, I've done the integrations with like WordPress and Wix and Squarespace, and there's still a level of disconnect between getting your FileMaker data back and forth. But this really does make it nice and simple.
Yeah. The setup is essentially a little bit of, so I mean, this is the BetterForms environment itself. Obviously, you have to have paid subscription to this service and then set up your account. The first thing you do is, enable your server, and it's XML. I don't know if the complete term XML process.
Yeah,
Publishing?
you have to enable XML web publishing
Web publishing
on the FileMaker server side. So.
Yeah. And then once that's enabled, just defining like a server interaction with that actual server that you define in their servers category, right? You saw me select Theater for this test app. That was already defined because I had created it before. But those initial setup items you'd have to do ahead of time. And then the mediator is the helper file. So all of your front end is communicating with a helper file that's also served on the back or as a database.
And that's a FileMaker file.
That's a FileMaker file linked to another FileMaker file.
So you link,
that's the setup.
You link your database to the helper file, and the helper file talks to the FileMaker BetterForms backend.
Yeah. And everything is BetterForms server, so serving the front end.
Right.
It's all their infrastructure.
An important thing too to note is that FileMaker Cloud doesn't support XML web publishing, so unfortunately you can't use BetterForms with a FileMaker Cloud hosted database.
Yeah, that is the one drawback. So I mean, if you're using cloud, you're probably not considering BetterForms because you can't. At least right now. I don't know. I don't think Charles has any plans of of changing that.
I think
Uh,
there's some tricky aspects having to do with Claris ID. I don't know the low-level details on that actually, but I'm not
I feel
sure.
like that's still the same challenge for full stack, even if you wanted to do full stack. So like WebDirect does support cloud. So if it's simple enough, maybe WebDirect for cloud
Yeah.
is
Well,
the way to go.
I still think that for the right application, for a simple enough application, or for, I shouldn't say simple exactly, but for the right use case, it's hard to beat WebDirect, especially if you don't really want to learn JSON, CSS,
Yeah, yeah.
HTML. If you don't have any expertise on that and don't care to learn it, it's pretty hard to beat WebDirect as a FileMaker developer. But on the other hand, it's hard to beat BetterForms if you've decided that you really want, that you're still going to use FileMaker, but you really want a full stack style compliant, fully web standards compliant web application that your end users are going to find indistinguishable from any other good web app that they're using. That you're
Yeah.
providing this really standard approach that you're not going to have to provide extra support for to understand why their back button doesn't work or whatever.
I feel like the comfort level though is changing given like the new AI tools that are supported. Like, I mean, you just saw me here inside of
Mhm.
BetterForms. If you don't know how to do something, right? And most
Right,
people are
right.
now using AI,
Yep.
at
Yeah.
least in the web platforms, you can ask, right? Ask it to build you something that you kind of have an idea of what it looks like in the UI, and it'll translate it into HTML and CSS, right?
Yeah.
If that's not your strong suit. And then you still have to have some knowledge, right? Because it's not going to be perfect. AI is not a perfect tool, but you can fine tune it and tailor it, till you get to your specific needs, and then probably having a little bit of knowledge of CSS probably and HTML, you can get it exactly where you need it, right?
Yeah, it gets you
Um,
a ton further than got before you had AI as the AI help.
yeah.
I mean,
No.
at least for those of us who are not, you know, JSON, HTML, CSS experts. Anybody want to throw out any questions or comments?
Just an observation. This sounds way more sophisticated than anything you could do in Clara Studio at this point.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
and I think it's important to note that Claris Studio's use case, Claris's goal with Claris Studio is different. You know, FM BetterForms is, its strong suit. It's raison d'etre. Its reason for existence is to let you create a web standards compliant web application. And Claris Studio is a slightly different use case. The use case there is to provide something like WebDirect, a tool that lets you create a web interface for gathering data and getting it into FileMaker that doesn't require the developer to have any kind of real web development experience, point and click, just like WebDirect. And so you're going to end up with an application that is more web standards compliant than WebDirect, but still doesn't give you all the flexibility of a tool like BetterForms or a full stack environment. So I think the use cases are a little bit different. I think there's totally a place for Claire Studio and BetterForms. And then of course
Yeah.
Claire Studio is still in its somewhat infancy, so we're going to have some limitations there because of its, where it is in its product life cycle also. I think. But I'm looking forward to Claire Studio getting better and better for sure. I think we'll find plenty of places to use it and BetterForms.
Yeah, I think BetterForms is like a good, I feel like BetterForms kind of bridges the gap between, full stack development and then, something like WebDirect where everything's FileMaker based. You're not really doing much actual web publishing or web development. It kind of bridges the gap between those two things to kind of somewhat get your toes wet and web developing. So it's good. And the thing with BetterForms too is it has a pretty active community. And so like I've utilized their Slack channel pretty heavily for resources and questions. And Charles Delph's like the main creator. He's pretty active in their channel. So yeah, there's a lot of good support there.
Yeah, I
For
think
a while, that was the only way. Not to be
Yeah.
negative, but for a while, that was the only way to get information if you didn't know what to do. Documentation was very bad early stages, but they've improved that. So
Yeah.
it is good to note that their support has been good from our perspective. That there is a good developer community for BetterForms, and that the product has been around for several years. It's not a brand new product or anything. It's a stable development environment. Anybody have anything else they want to throw out? I don't know. I guess the big question is, Charlie, did we answer the question?
Well,
bring it back around.
not to
Yeah,
market BetterForms so much, but I mean,
I think it's definitely something that we should take a look at. And maybe Jacob and I, or Russell and I, can sit down and look at the form that I'm trying to replicate and see what we can do to make it happen.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think it's, as I understand the user base for the application, it does seem like one where it would be, the users they're more predictable. They're not completely anonymous, but they're anonymous enough that it would be nice to have a really standard web experience for them.
Exactly.
Well, that seems like a good place to call it, unless anybody has any last minute comments. So thanks everyone this morning, and just to emulate our friend Dan, get back to work.
Thank you for spending your time with us at the FileMaker DevCast today. We hope you found something useful, something thought-provoking, and something to take into your own development approach. Things that help you to be more productive and to allow you and your team to get more done in less time. Find us online at portagebay.com and FileMaker-DevCast.com, and also on social media at FM DevCast and Portage Bay. Let us know if we can help you or your company with modernizing your approaches and streamlining your workflow. We look forward to seeing you at the next DevCast.
Thank
Cool.
you.
Thanks,
Cool.
thanks everyone.
Brought to you by Calpy Tips.
Oh, are those shrimp chips, Joe?
Oh yeah,
Oh,
buddy.
nice.
Oh yeah. Oh.
Nice.
I don't think I've ever had those.
These are wasabi ones, which are
Nice.
oh, you and your wasabi.
Sounds good. Have you ever had-
it's kind of a regular, that and this is sad. I have trips and hoisin sauce at my desk at all times.
Have you ever
Those
had
are the
those
essential items.
Have you ever had those pea snacks?
The wasabi.
Pea
wasabi
snaps.
Yeah,
Dry
those
peas.
Those are good.
Yeah.
Great. I like to mix those in with trail mix sometimes.
Oh,
Oh.
pretty good.